May 5th, 1945. The engines never stopped. Tanks kept rolling across shell-pocked fields, columns of armored vehicles hunched under a grey sky. The map was changing by the hour. George S. Patton's Third Army had driven 600 miles in 3 months, smashed through the Rhine, shattered the last organized defenses of the Wehrmacht, and was pushing east with the raw momentum of a force convinced it could keep going. Men were exhausted. Supply lines were stretched. Yet opportunity, by every military measure, still existed. Speed, initiative, the enemy broken. And then the radio crackled. Halt, hold positions. The orders came down from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The surging lines stopped. For Patton, the question was immediate and visceral. Why stop now? This is the story of how decisions made months earlier in a palace on the Black Sea landed on a battlefield in Central Europe, and how those choices, centered on a frail president in February 1945, helped shape the map and the decades that followed. If you like deep historical breakdowns, subscribe now and stay with me. Patton believed in momentum. By spring 1945, his doctrine had been vindicated on countless fields. Mobility mattered more than mass. Audacity could turn retreat into rout. The Third Army chased collapsing formations, cut off pockets of resistance, and crossed rivers that armies had failed to hold for years. His view was straightforward. If American forces could reach Prague, if a Western barrier could be placed between Soviet forces and the heart of Central Europe, then the balance after victory might look very different. In Patton's calculations, the Soviet advance, formidable as it was, could be checked in certain sectors. If Western armies moved decisively before the garrisoning and political arrangements on the ground hardened. Yet the strategic picture at the very top looked different. Supreme Commander Eisenhower had orders and a diplomatic reality to respect. Lines were not drawn on whim, but emerged from agreements hammered out earlier that year in the Crimea. The Halt orders were not simply a military judgment about supply. They embodied political decisions. Patton, staring at maps and burning with impatience, saw bureaucracy and diplomacy freeze the map while Soviet divisions continued to pour forward. He saw a political settlement taking precedence over the battlefield's logic. He reacted with anger and bewilderment. But Eisenhower enforced the halt. The army stopped. To understand why that radio message mattered so much, we rewind to February 4-11, 1945, to Yalta, Crimea. The grand hotels and palm-lined promenades of that Black Sea resort hosted one of the most consequential meetings of the 20th century. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin sat at the same table. The room was staged for power. The photographs show Roosevelt gaunt, his face thin, hands trembling. Contemporary observers recorded bouts of fatigue. Some diplomats later described moments when the president seemed worn to a shadow of his earlier self. Historians debate how much his physical condition affected his judgment. What is clear is that Roosevelt wanted a settlement that would end the war and build a stable peace, and he was willing to accept compromises to secure Soviet cooperation against Japan and to ensure a framework for post-war institutions. Stalin arrived with precise aims. He sought security for the Soviet Union, territory and influence in Eastern Europe, and control in areas of immediate strategic interest. His bargaining position was strong. Red Army troops already occupied vast tracts of territory. Churchill, who had traveled from London determined to check Soviet aims, complained repeatedly in private about concessions that seemed to cede influence over Poland, Romania, and other states. He warned that promises to hold free and unfettered elections could become hollow when one side held the guns on the ground. Roosevelt, facing a potent and determined counterpart, brokered agreements that reflected both public pledges and understandings about spheres of influence. Some of those understandings were not fully aired in Congress or with all American officials. Later released documents and diplomatic notes would show arrangements about occupation zones in Germany and other practical understandings about the post-war order. Scholars note that not every detail of Yalta was secret in the sense of conspiratorial, but some practical decisions and the full weight of their implications were not widely communicated at the time. One of the clearest tensions at Yalta came down to Poland. Churchill and many in Britain saw Poland as a moral touchstone, a nation invaded and partitioned twice in a generation, while Stalin demanded a sway in Warsaw as a guarantee of security. Roosevelt sought a compromise that would reconcile Soviet security concerns with a promise of democratic processes. Historians differ on whether that compromise was naive, pragmatic, or the only path available given the balance of forces. But the practical upshot, Soviet troops present in Eastern Europe and an Allied willingness to draw lines of control, would later prove decisive on the ground. When Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, The fragile framework negotiating Crimea shifted from theory to reality under different hands. Harry S. Truman, vice president for only weeks, suddenly faced a world he had only partially been briefed on. He stepped into the presidency with limited first-hand knowledge of the private aspects of Yalta. Truman's personal shock was real. His ascent altered the dynamics at the top even as armies on the ground continued to move and occupy territory. Back in Central Europe, the practical enforcement of the Yalta arrangements came down to orders. Eisenhower and his staff felt the pressure of civilian leaders' decisions and the diplomatic settlements their commanders were meant to uphold. There were also genuine military concerns behind some prudence. Fears of overextension, logistical constraints, and the intelligence picture that sometimes exaggerated German capacities in pockets that had to be secured. In the moment, however, these military cautions read to many like timidity. To Patton, they read like the sacrifice of strategic opportunity for the sake of previously arranged political lines. Prague fell into Soviet hands before American columns could move in to assert a Western presence. Germany's formal surrender arrived on May 7-8, 1945, but where the lines had been drawn months earlier at Yalta now became the de facto map of occupation. The Red Army's presence across Poland, the Baltic states, Eastern Germany, and parts of Czechoslovakia hardened into control. In the months and years to come, elections and politics in many of these countries would be constrained or reworked under Soviet influence. Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946 would name a division already visible on the ground. Patton did more than stew in private. He warned loudly and publicly about Soviet behavior. He collected reports, stories from liberated towns, accounts of brutality and reprisals, and sent dispatches emphasizing the danger of leaving the eastern flank to untrammeled Soviet control. He argued that the Soviet Union, like any great power, would consolidate what it occupied. He suggested that military action could check that consolidation. For many policymakers, however, Patton's posture became politically difficult. His bluntness, his willingness to politicize military success, and his combative personality made him a lightning rod. In an atmosphere when the United States was trying to navigate a transition from wartime alliance to post-war order, outspoken commanders could complicate delicate diplomacy. By the late summer and autumn of 1945, Patton's role in Europe had been reduced. Removed from the front lines of policymaking and reassigned by Eisenhower's decisions, he was sidelined as occupation duties and diplomatic imperatives took over. In December 1945, he was fatally injured in an automobile accident and died days later. There is a bitter irony in that sequence. A commander who had pressed for aggressive action at a critical junction would not live to see how the political map would be disputed for decades. The consequences extended far beyond any single general's career. Eastern Europe's political trajectory was altered for a generation. Millions found themselves under Soviet-backed regimes. Dissent was suppressed. Alignments hardened into two opposing blocs. The Cold War emerged not from a single cause, but from a complex mix of wartime expedients, security anxieties, ideological competition, and the distribution of military forces at the moment of surrender. Yalta's arrangements, and the way they were enforced, communicated, and implemented, were among the ingredients in that mix. This is where the title's question lands. Why does FDR's decision in 1945 still haunt us today? Part of the answer is institutional. Leadership matters most at hinge points. When presidents, prime ministers, and commanders make choices in moments of personal fatigue, political urgency, or incomplete information, those choices can cascade. Roosevelt's health, his desire for a durable settlement, and his willingness to accept certain Soviet demands reflected both personal limits and geopolitical realities. Historians argue about whether different diplomatic strategies would have led to better outcomes or whether the realities of Soviet occupation made those alternatives implausible. But the broader lesson is about transparency and democratic oversight. When major decisions are shaped by private understandings not fully communicated to legislatures or the public, accountability is weakened and the long-term consequences become harder to contest. There is also a moral dimension. The war had been fought to liberate nations from tyranny. Yet liberation in many places slid into a new form of domination. The promises of free elections and sovereign self-determination strained under the weight of power politics. Leaders had to choose between immediate peace and longer-term principles. They debated security against the ideals that had motivated millions to fight. The result was neither wholly cynical nor purely principled. It was a compromise made in the shadow of the Red Army's boots. Finally, there is Patton's voice as a warning to posterity. He was not a diplomat. He was a soldier who saw danger in the consolidation of another great power sphere. His rhetoric was abrasive. His solutions were often blunt. But his core discomfort deserves attention. The idea that military outcomes and political agreements must align if the peace is to be stable and just. That alignment did not, in 1945, prevent spheres of influence from solidifying. The Cold War that followed would be costly in lives, resources, and opportunities for freedom. None of this is simple. None of it reduces to a single villain or a single mistake. Historians will continue to debate Roosevelt's capacity, Stalin's ambitions, Churchill's urgings, Eisenhower's prudence, Truman's surprise, and Patton's judgment. What the record does show is that decisions made in small rooms, under great strain, and with incomplete disclosure, can echo across decades. Those echoes shape borders, governance, and the geopolitical imagination of the post-war world. As we look back now, 70-plus years on, the lesson is not to indict an individual alone, but to ask how societies structure decisions in moments of crisis. Do leaders have the capacity and the counsel they need? Are agreements transparent enough to allow democratic correction? Can military initiative and political prudence ever be reconciled in ways that preserve both security and liberty? Patton's anger, his sense of a squandered opportunity, and his tragic sidelining are part of a larger cautionary tale about the cost of leadership under strain. FDR's decisions at Yalta, made in a particular human and strategic context, helped set a course whose consequences were felt for a lifetime and beyond. They haunt us not because they were the only cause of later conflict, but because they illuminate how fragile peace can be when built on partial knowledge and private negotiation. Share your thoughts in the comments. Could different choices at Yalta have meaningfully altered the post-war map, or were Soviet forces and security concerns already decisive? If you found this deep dive useful, watch our next video on how Churchill's warnings at the time anticipated the Iron Curtain, and subscribe for more critical turning points in history.